ladies and gentlemen. Let me start my remarks with a quote from Mwalimu Julius K. Nyerere when he addressed a G77 conference in Arusha in February of 1979. He said, and I quote, "The unity of the whole world is necessary for fundamental change in the present world economic arrangement. The so-called neutrality of the marketplace turned out to be a neutrality between the exploiter and the exploited, between the bird of prey and its victim," end of quote. Some of you may be astounded by my use of the word fellow to address you Foreign Service officers. I have used the word deliberately to reaffirm my deepest sense of belonging to this ministry. It is in this ministry that I kicked off my career in public service as a Foreign Service officer, like you, as a third secretary. And as many of you may be aware, I served as Tanzanian ambassador in Nigeria, Canada, and the United States, and also as Minister of Foreign Affairs in 2 phases of the Tanzanian government. So I am pretty much a retired Foreign Service officer, although I can assure you that in terms of discharging my share of responsibilities, especially in international engagements, I am not tired. I commend the management of the ministry for organizing such lectures, as these will allow productive intellectual exchanges and knowledge sharing, which is not only necessary, but fundamental in the effective discharge of your duties as Foreign Service officers. It is especially so in this world we currently live in, where knowledge is a vitally important source of power, and survival of the fittest is increasingly becoming its most befitting epithet. Foreign Service officers, as public servants, positioned at the front desk of our country, ought to have unfathomable understanding of the idiosyncrasies of this anarchical world. The increasing significance of soft over hard power in the conduct of international affairs makes the quest for knowledge an indispensable undertaking. Seminars like this will go a long way to ensure efficient and effective discharge of your duties. I must admit, I agonized for some time over what I should pick as the topic of my talk, for I had quite a number of issues on my mind. I decided on economic diplomacy and the new international economic order because there are worrisome developing aspects of this broad topic that constitute a source of my apprehension and about the contemporary international economic order. In the first 4 decades of independence, African states were preoccupied with political diplomacy. They had no option. Newly independent, they faced the challenge of asserting their identity, fostering their newly won freedom, and taking their places in the cluster of international organizations. They had to ward off the covetous hands of the nations locked in the Cold War. Additionally, they wrestled with the mission of completing the total liberation of the continent, itself a full-time political preoccupation. Diplomacy was therefore largely the promulgation, the advancement of political relations. We in Tanzania felt this weight of political relations very acutely because of our proximity to colonially ruled and racist regimes. Although Mwalimu found time to evolve the national economic philosophy of socialism and self-reliance, he spent more time questioning the political relations that promoted and upheld colonialism and apartheid. It was only a matter of time, however, before he also began to question the global economic architecture and its impact on the development aspirations of the newly independent countries, the so-called developing countries. The movement for a new international economic order gathered momentum. Upon retirement, Mwalimu was tasked by the non-aligned movement to give the challenge his full attention, with formation of the South Commission, of which he was chairman. It is fair in sum to state that the Commission report demonstrated that the global economic architecture was constructed to the distinct disadvantage of developing countries. Nowhere is this most evident than in the area of international trade rules and systems, the WTO notwithstanding. And this, the international trade rules and systems, is the subject matter of my talk today. But first, a definition. What is economic diplomacy? Economic diplomacy is the deployment of diplomacy in furtherance of the national economy. The deployment of diplomacy in furtherance of the national economy. I have picked on China to show us how and what economic diplomacy can achieve, because they have, in 30 years, succeeded in raising the Chinese economy from being the fourth or fifth largest to the second largest economy in the world in 30 years, second only to the United States, because of economic diplomacy. According to the China Institute for International Studies, they have done so, that is the Chinese, by deliberately enhancing international influence, improving the overall diplomatic environment for peace, development, cooperation, and what they describe as win-win situations. China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs has taken the lead in setting the goal of cooperation and has been active in the formulation of international economic rules. Working with the Ministry of Trade and Industry, they have strengthened economic exchanges and promoted diversified participation of the private sector, non-governmental organizations, and their business community. And the ministry has improved the economic literacy of its diplomats. If China has done this, the least we can do is learn from its experience. Mr. Minister, in international trade, there has been the emergence of the so-called economic partnership agreements. And my discussion will look at their consequences upon us as developing nations. I will also touch on other regional agreements like the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP, between Europe and America, as well as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, popularly known collectively as mega-regionals. The impact of these mega-regionals to regional trading arrangements in sub-Saharan Africa is very adverse and very certain, because besides their geographical spread and respective weights in world economic output and trade, they hold the common objective of dominating the world trading architecture of which we are part. It is incumbent upon you to understand their potential impact, and as Foreign Service officers, devise better ways to help your country mitigate against their impact and promote your country's enlightened self-interest. Is it still the truest depiction of the current North-South dichotomy in the socio-economic spectrum but also it remains as relevant today as it was then. The only difference is that while Mwalimu and his likes in the leadership of Africa in the South mounted a formidable and a spirited challenge to the status quo to free themselves from the economic quagmire, we today, either subconsciously or out of sheer helplessness, are playing implicit to our own exploitation. This is the source of my apprehension. Ironically, most of the relationships we forge and agreements we enter into today with the West in our ostensible attempt to diversify our market opportunities, to integrate our economies in the global value chains, and attract sustainable investment, they have the opposite effect. At the present time, when the dynamic interplay of the processes of globalization makes countries become intricately interrelated, I reiterate what I said on April 30th, 2004, when I addressed our ambassadors serving abroad at the Serena Hotel in Ngorongoro, that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and therefore foreign service officers, need to adapt to the ever-changing and complicated world of international relations. For the international environment you as foreign service officers confront today is very dynamic and change-laden. These changes that you ought to adapt to are both qualitative and quantitative in the scope of issues and the framework of actors. The clearest manifestation of this is that in the quest for information necessary to give countries an edge over others in this period of economic diplomacy, ministries of foreign affairs, through their embassies, have become centrally important sources of information for their governments. Africa is an epicenter of the world's resources war. The latest leakable cable by Al Jazeera is a testimony to this and portrays Africa as the 21st century theater of espionage, economic espionage. The Guardian newspaper of Britain, in its February 24th issue, went further to christen Africa as the El Dorado of espionage. The cables have pointed Africa as a focus of international spying during this second scramble for the continent, with South Africa as the country with the highest number of embassies in Africa and the continent's powerhouse and communication hub being, understandably, the epicenter of such activities. These are startling revelations and should serve as a wake-up call to you. Cables have further revealed that embassies, which are constituent parts of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, are the engine rooms for this new resource war. With such revelations, it is clear that others are working overtime to foster their interests, even at the expense of ours. It is imperative that we shed the mystique of Africa is rising and lose focus on the truism that true development is self-development. Let me commence by underlying the fact, in my view, that Africa is again in trouble. Its future is once again on the negotiating table. And it is Europe, not the purportedly independent Africa, that holds the ace. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 balkanized Africa among 13 European powers as a guaranteed source of raw materials and a market for their goods. One may perhaps critique this analogy with the argument that this current intercourse is consented by free people under perfectly democratic regimes on our continent, after protracted negotiations during which every party's interests are thoroughly scrutinized. It is, however, foolhardy to subscribe to such a flimsy and idealistic narrative. The reality is that Africa has negotiated these economic partnership agreements under unprecedented economic duress and coercion. In the process, African governments were arm-twisted into glossing over some very pertinent aspects of the agreement, essentially for the European Union's economic expediency. It is against this background that I see the current contraption of the Economic Partnership Agreements, EPAs, orchestrated from Brussels as the modern-day equivalent of the Berlin Conference Treaty. The common element at both Berlin and Brussels is that Africa was not allowed attitude to conduct trade, industrial and development policies for our own development, but for the development of Europe. I am aware that most of African trade ministers have privately and tacitly rejected the economic partnership agreements, but in fact, they have acquiesced. In private whisperings, not many Africans or policymakers are happy with the deal, but there is a certain sense of helplessness. I have also learned that we have just signed yet another economic partnership agreement with the Americans just last month. I don't know the intricate details of this agreement, so I will refrain from commenting anything about it. Since 2002, the European Union has been negotiating the EPAs with the Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific countries as a fully reciprocal trade arrangement between the European Union and the ACP to replace the previous non-reciprocal preferential trade access of ACP countries to EU markets under the various Lome Conventions and the Cotonou Agreement. Consequently, true to the spirit of divide and prevail, the ACP countries are divided into 7 regions, with 5 in Africa, for the purposes of negotiations, while individual countries also negotiate. In order to continue to have access to European markets on the terms that it had enjoyed for more than 3 decades, Africa is now required to eliminate tariffs on over 80% of imports from the European Union. I repeat, they are required to eliminate tariffs on over 80% of imports from the European Union. In some cases, they will abolish all export duties and taxes. In others, countries can retain existing export taxes, but not increase them or introduce new taxes. They will be called upon to eliminate all quantitative restrictions and meet all kinds of other intrusive and destructive conditionalities that literally tie the hands of African governments from deploying the same kinds of instruments that all countries that have industrialized applied to build competitive national economies. Isn't this downright economic suicide for Africans? What do the EPAs provide for? And what impact will these provisions have on East African communities, economies, for instance? The key principle is market access on the basis of reciprocity. Parties have agreed to eliminate tariffs on imports originating from another party. East African countries will reduce, and in a matter of years, not decades, eliminate tariffs on imports from the EU up to 82% by 2033. There is, however, within EPA, a so-called domestic industry clause to address concerns about protection of nascent domestic industries. The clause can be invoked to justify imposition duty or tax by East African countries on products which seem to jeopardize growth of some domestic industries. There is, however, a caveat that invoking the clause is subject to prior notification and consent from the European Union, thereby rendering it a non-starter. The tariff elimination demanded by the EPAs means domestic producers will lose market share to European imports. This insistence on complete elimination of tariffs must be viewed against the European Union's refusal to deal with agricultural subsidies the EU provides domestic supports in agriculture to the tune of between 80 to 90 billion euros per year. Can East African domestic production of milk, poultry, pork, beef, cereals, etc., seriously compete with the EU's products? You know, yesterday, for the first time in years, I was served the cereals from the United States in a package which was described as produced in the United States. And you know how much they cost? They cost 8,000 shillings. But we grow the maize. If anyone here should start trying to think that they can make the crackers out of the maize we grow and then export them and let them compete with the crackers from the United States on the European market, or European crackers on the European markets, they are dreaming. On the contrary, because of the taste nature of our people, who think that everything European is better than anything African, we will lose the market for our own production and our own value addition. That is the tragedy. EAC's regional trade will be jeopardized. EU products are likely to flow into these regional groups and displace domestic and regional production. It is therefore important to ask ourselves two very pertinent questions. One, what was really wrong with non-reciprocal agreement of the likes of the all but arms, if at all the spirit of the EU-EAC economic partnership is to help us grow and develop? Or is it that non-reciprocity fatigue has set in on the part of the European Union? And if it is, why don't state frankly? Two, is there anything ulterior in the EU's insistence on reciprocity? Are they seeing something that we don't? The elimination of tariffs will also have an adverse impact on state revenues. In the case of Tanzania, for example, a modest estimate on current trade figures is that tariff losses could be up to $62 million a year. As for export taxes, against the strident objections by many African countries, the European Union continues to insist on their being eliminated export taxes, so they can have free access to our raw materials. I find it logical to view this insistence in tandem with the EU's raw material initiative launched in 2008. And that initiative, the European Union's initiative on raw materials, states in respect of Africa that access to primary and secondary raw materials is a priority in EU trade and regulatory policy. Yet, it is a known fact that export tax is a sine qua non of the promotion of higher value-added activities and the beginnings of industrialization. There are two more clauses in the EPA negotiations which make the productive agreements non-developmental for Eastern Africa. The first is the most favored nation clause, the MFN. It obliges us in the East African community to accord to the European Union party any more favorable treatment applicable as a result of EAC countries having a free trade agreement with a major economy. Whatever conditions, this makes our countries less attractive for prospective free trade area partners, since these partners will always have to compete with Europe in our market causing serious trade diversion and serious trade deflection. The second clause, you can see that is really to take care of China and your relations with China. The second clause, the rendezvous clause, concerns the so-called Singapore issues, namely competition, investment, transparency in public procurement, intellectual property rights, and even possibly labor and environment. With the exception of Kenya, East African countries are LDCs, least developed countries, and the WTO allows them a transition period before they implement reciprocity. But the EU wants us to provide equal competitive conditions or as favorable treatment to foreign countries as those enjoyed by local companies. Yet, supporting local companies is a strategy that has been used by many countries that have successfully developed. I find that demand inconceivable and hard to subscribe to. Another area of my discomfort with regard to the EPAs is on the fact that while EPA oblige East African governments to undertake significant reforms and design and create new policies which will have significant costs attached, including adjustment costs and revenue loss as a consequence of tariff elimination, the European Union has vehemently refused to include a development matrix in the Economic Partnership Agreement. Instead, the burden of assembling development capital is left to the recycled, unreliable, and cumbersome European Development Fund and the Aid for Trade program. The East African community was fully aware of the EU tactic to remain non-committal and non-responsive on any proposal to include economic and development issues in the Economic Partnership Agreements. In July 2009, after being irked by EU's indifference to this concern, the East African community postponed signing of the Interim Economic Partnership Agreement. The argument of the East African community was, and I quote, "Given the sensitivity and impact the EPA is likely to have on the EAC partner states' economies, it will be difficult to effect the ratification through the national legislatures without inbuilt economic and development safety nets to support the required economic adjustments." End of quote. Despite those justifiable concerns from the East African community, the European Union maintained their stance. We caved in as EPA was later signed without a development matrix and culminated into an extremely unfavorable and economically unfriendly agreement. I am also aware of arguments by some proponents of the Economic Partnership Agreement that the revenue losses and the adjustment costs that the East African countries will incur will be offset from the increase in market access. Fortunately, past experience with ABA and AGOA suggests otherwise. That is just another misguided and ill-placed argument devoid of any plausible substance. It is the argument which is predicated on the false premise that poor developing countries can grow their economies without proactive promotion of local industrialization and value addition, on the one hand, and preferential access to developed country mega-regional markets on the other. Mr. Minister, we now have then the emergence of the mega-regional trade agreements. While we are deeply embroiled in the discussions on the potential impacts of EPAs, there is another worrying development in the international trade regime. There are trade negotiations currently going on between the three powerful entities in the global trading system: the United States, the European Union, and Asia. On one hand, there is negotiation for a free trade agreement between the US and the EU, known as the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP. On the other hand, there is an FTA being negotiated between the United States and a number of Asia and American states known as the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But there is also a relatively less significant regional comprehensive economic partnerships that cover much of Asia. Now, these multi-country, globally significant in terms of their trade impact and regulation-intensive agreements are wide in scope and deep in ambition and constitute a major distraction to the stalled multilateral trade negotiations under the aegis of the WTO. These proposed agreements are laden with many implications for non-party states like us and for the entire global trading system. For once the negotiations are completed and new regulatory frameworks are agreed by the participating countries, they will apply to trade and investment relations with the rest of the world, including sub-Saharan Africa. The newly agreed standards will not be easy to modify in the World Trade Organization negotiations or elsewhere. They will fix members' positions in future negotiations and form the basis for their negotiating position in the multilateral trade negotiations. This will result into further fragmentation of the global trading system with different standards adopted by different sets of countries. The onset of mega-regionals, I must say, is partly the outcrop of the impasse, the stalemate in the WTO negotiations. But they have already sucked negotiating energy out of the multilateral trading system, where we all have voices to address our concerns. These mega blocks potentially unbundle a complex tapestry of global trading systems. We in the developing countries feel we have a stake in them because we have just signed FTAs with both the US and the EU, and with full cognizance of their geopolitical significance to the global trade. I will confine my talk to the potential impact of mega-regionals on the TTIP. It has become apparent that the TTIP negotiations, that's the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership, between the US and the European Union are going to influence very adversely not only the EAC's trade regimes with the US and Europe, but also sub-Saharan Africa's at large. I see two possible consequences of the TTP once finalized. First, it could divert trade from the East African countries. And second, the TTP could open European Union and United States market for East African countries' products. This has implications for the conduct of business in the WTO, the reform of global trading systems, as well as existing bilateral trade arrangements. There are, however, not so many studies that focus on the impacts of mega-regionals to developing countries. Yet there is a plausible apprehension about their destabilizing potential to the current trading regimes between the US, the EU, and developing countries, including East Africa. The TTIP arrangements that encapsulate new rules and regulatory establishments for members are in fact exclusionary to non-members. In East Africa, we ought to be concerned because such agreements will substantially narrow our trade preferences, precipitate terms of trade shocks, and compromise our endeavor to enhance our participation in global value chains. The extent of this effect will, of course, depend on both the existing levels of trade and the structure of trade between our countries and members of each of the regional trade arrangements. There are a number of channels through which the TTP agreements can impact on us. The first is the direct effect the TTP agreements can have on existing EAC's access to EU and US markets on preferential terms that are not available to middle and high-income country, which in our case is only Kenya. And second is the impact that the reduction of non-tariff measures and the harmonization of standards within the TTP arrangements can have on either raising or reducing export costs for our countries. Generally speaking, the ability of resource-stricken East African countries to gain access to these TTP countries will progressively depend on their compliance with both technical and non-technical non-tariff measures that in fact go beyond the realm of traditional trade policies. Therefore, in order to fully comprehend the implications of the TTP for our countries, we are intellectually challenged to find answers to the following questions. Is there a risk that TTP will result in the European Union and the United States stepping up trade with each other while importing less from previous trade partners in other world regions, and in particular East African states? How can TTP be designed in a way that allows us in the East African community, for example, other developing countries in general, as well as rising powers, to benefit from the agreement instead of suffering market losses? Should global trade policy receive more attention from development actors in general? Should the excluded developing countries like us in East Africa be worried about the TTP trade agreement? If yes, how should we respond? And what might these arrangements mean for the World Trade Organization? While the TTP negotiations are well underway, African nations, especially in sub-Saharan region, are concurrently engaged in discussions with major partners over institutional arrangements for long-term developmental and strategic relations. The African Growth and Opportunities Act, which is the centerpiece of the USA economic relations with the region since 2000, is up for renewal in 2015, against the backdrop of a fair degree of uncertainty regarding the terms of any new agreement. In other words, whether they will renew the AGOA. EU economic partnership agreements have already been finalized, and a number of member states of individual countries have either signed or initialed interim EPA agreements, though no country has fully ratified an EPA with the European Union. So, all is not lost, at least not yet. The biggest problem I see with this proliferation of free trade agreements, without consequent efforts to harmonize trade preferences, is the increase in compliance costs on the part of our producers. One of the reasons why, despite being non-reciprocal, EBA did not benefit developing countries much was because of the stringent and cumbersome rules of origin, ROOs. So, if no proper harmonization of preference is done, then you will find that a product from East Africa under this EPA complies with EU's rules of origin requirements and qualifies for preferential access, but it then fails to meet the United States rules of origin requirements, necessitating some additional adjustment for it to qualify for the US market. This entails an upsurge in the production costs unless the EU and USA in the current TTIP negotiations decide to harmonize their trade preferences. So, you find that the same product from Tanzania is subject to East African communities, SADCs, the European Union's, and the US's different rules of origin, thereby requiring costly adjustments on each stage. This is a phenomenon that Professor Jagdish Bhagwati of Columbia University, in his 1995 paper, US Trade Policy, The Infatuation with Free Trade Agreements, termed the spaghetti bowl effect. It essentially refers to the complication which I alluded to earlier, that arises from the application of domestic rules of origin in the signing of free trade agreements across nations. In this case, a product from Tanzania is subjected to different tariffs and tariff reduction trajectories for the purpose of domestic preferences in such a way that it is impossible to tell which rule starts from where and ends where, just as spaghetti would appear in a bowl such that you wouldn't be able to tell which individual spaghetti starts and ends where. So, Minister, I now ask myself, do we know our problem? And is there an answer? My stake is, we really don't know our problem. To me, our problem is not the political alignment with the rest of the world. It is the economic alignment that has perpetually condemned us into being hewers of wood and fetchers of water for our masters. Our economic appendage to former colonialists and imperialists is still there, and it unfortunately runs very deep. While we currently have the wherewithal to coalesce Pan-Africanist efforts in collaboration with other emerging economies such as BRICS, in order to extricate ourselves from the stranglehold of imperialistic international economic order, But we have ironically relented and not been able to take full advantage of the present geopolitical reality of the rise of China, India, and others that really works to our advantage. This is where you, as Foreign Service officers, can make use of abundant information available in the information superhighway to play aggressive diplomacy that will inform the big powers of your understanding of their innuendos, their schemes, and your resolve to protect your interests at all costs, and your unreadiness to take mediocre proposals that do not take your interests at heart. It is exactly through this no-nonsense, down-to-earth diplomacy that Tanzania won so much accolades on the international political front and was a respectable member in the multilateral negotiations arena. With properly governed states, efficient and effective public service institutions, and skilled human resources. To bring this about, we need to rethink development and not simply go deeper in directions that have not served us. Africa needs to reclaim its own internal markets and set the terms of engagement in trade rules that lead to industrial development and the flourishing of our agricultural and services sectors. The existing liberalization paradigm in trade rules, including the beyond-the-border disciplines, need to be put to question. A new paradigm of our relations with Europe will necessitate substantial unscrambling of historical and existing ties, and the putting in place of new framework of trade and investment based on mutual respect, understanding of our different levels of development, and an awakening on both sides that Europe too needs Africa. Reciprocal trade preferences to its neighboring countries, such as the Western Balkans since the year 2000. That agreement allows nearly all their exports, that's the Balkans exports, to enter the European Union without customs duties or limits on quantities. In seeking a waiver at the WTO for these non-reciprocal preferences, the European Union has said the following, and I quote, "Terminating the trade preferences would have a negative impact on the overall economic performance of the Western Balkans, with consequent negative repercussions on their domestic reform and transitional processes. Moreover, given the current worldwide economic slowdown, the Western Balkans' economic recovery could be seriously jeopardized," unquote. If a different paradigm is acknowledged to be good for the Western Balkans, why is the discourse different for Africa? Do you, as Foreign Service officers, fathom these conspicuous double standards in trade negotiations with Africa and the rest? Do you use such knowledge to front your position in trade negotiations? Meanwhile, events unfold relentlessly towards disparate conclusions. The TTP will conclude with a mega regional arrangement. Because of its historical ties with Europe, we in East Africa will wind up being roped in as a distant participant. Our participation is being determined irrevocably by the conclusion of the economic partnership agreements, because pressure can be expected to be brought to bear on African countries' legislature to conclude EPA with formal ratifications, and they have until October of next year. We are in this state of global affairs where almost nothing is working in our favor. The whirlwind of mega-regionals constitutes a deviation from the universally preferred multilateral global trading system, namely the WTO. The European Union and the USA are trenchantly determined not to reform their agricultural sectors and the elimination of various subsidies and supports. Effectively, those who preach the gospel of free trade and competition are themselves guilty of protectionist conduct on various pretexts and under multifarious guises. In the midst of this, we, in the developing countries, remain weak, divided, and lack the courage and will to claim our entitlement to special and differentiated responsibilities. I understand it is no point being nostalgic at this point, but the economic agenda for the South, on a global scale, spearheaded by Mwalimu in the 70s, was valid then but still very valid today. This agenda would help us address these anomalies inherent in this northerly biased international economic order. You, as foreign service officers, strategically trusted by your compatriots to stand at the doorstep of our country, do you let everyone in at the full realization of what we know of their motives? It is only until you impart yourselves with enough knowledge and incubate a deep sense of patriotism within yourselves that you can be able to rekindle the courage to protest against anyone. We once possessed the courage of nationalism. Unfortunately, it has waned in recent times and has become almost unfashionable. Is there a rationale for us in Africa to abandon promotion of intra-Africa trade? Certainly not. The 2013 United Nations Economic Commission for Africa report on international and intra-African trade indicated that Africa sustained a meager 3.2% share of global trade. The enduring prevalence of lack of value addition in Africa's predominantly raw material-based export portfolio has meant that Africa's export fortunes are contingent on commodity price movements, exacerbating the continent's susceptibility to external shocks. The solution, therefore, lies in expanding regional trade, which will provide Africa with opportunities to address major constraints to export competitiveness imposed by small sizes of our economies. Regional trade will enable African enterprises to enhance competitiveness through exploiting economies of scale associated with large market, and this will serve as the first step towards building capacity for subsequent export globally. UNECA is in fact suggesting that Africa is under-trading. This is the UN Economic Commission for Africa, is in fact suggesting that Africa is under-trading with itself and could potentially realize more trade given geographical proximity, cultural affinity, and the size of our economies. In general, the historical trend, especially in the period 2002 to 2010, shows a positive trend in export within the regional economic communities every year. The only exception is a pronounced fall in total intra-regional economic community exports in 2009, predominantly influenced by the global financial crisis. Absence of the East African community in the list of top 4 entails that there is a huge potential to improve intra-East African community trade, and that should be our main preoccupation instead of jumping to the economic partnership agreements. Having said all that, as I have said, I remain fully convinced that all is not lost. The system of preferences is the Marshall Plan of the developing countries. We have to continue fighting for that policy space. Our main focus should then be directed towards developing intra-regional and intra-Africa trade, which will help us build, develop, and sustain the capacity to be a meaningful player in the global value chains, production and exchange. When that is achieved, then EPAs can come, short of which we will continue to be architects of our own social economic retrogression. A fair globalization is possible. Play your part. Thank you for your attention.